Hello and welcome to As the CMMC Churns. I'm Matt Titcomb from Peak InfoSec. Peak InfoSec is an authorized CMMC third-party assessment organization, or C3PO. I'm also a CMMC certified assessor and certified professional. Today we're going to start a new kind of sub-series of As the CMMC Churns, specifically understanding the security requirements. We're going to dig into some of the more commonly misunderstood and controls that we tend to have the most problems with when we're assessing clients. So we're going to start off on a relatively easy one, and we're going to start with alternate work sites, 3.10.6. Jumping in, so let's start always with key definitions. When we look at the requirement, our job is to enforce the safeguarding measures for CUI at alternate work sites. Well, what pops out first is safeguarding. So when we look at safeguarding, the definition coming from the NIST glossary, which is where we will always defer to first, clearly gives us a good definition. So you could replace the verb safeguarding with most of that first sentence. Now, likewise, the problem is alternate work sites. There's not a definition in NIST for that. So the problem is what we can kind of think of as this is anywhere a person is using a part of your information system that is not protected by all the requirements in 3.10.1-5, all the physical security controls. A little bit of media protection, as you'll see, also comes into play in this. And they're also accessing your system via an external network, home office, Starbucks, etc., or they're working offline. Could be physical media, or they're just laptops offline and not connected to anything. Now, in that context, now with that alternate work sites, well, now we kind of do bring in, the definition for remote access. So that's the organizational system user, or POW, communicating through an external network. Now, that could be a remote user VPN. That could be the laptop reaching out across the internet to your Office 365 tenant. Your tenant is considered internal, and that is a remote access to your internal access. The other thing that kicks in here is we get to remote access. Now we have to make sure we're all clear of the definition of external network. It's something not controlled by your organization. So that person's home network and everything else is external. You do not control it. And you really do not want to try and bring that into scope because it gets really ugly really fast. Now, related to this, we now need to jump into the discussion. Now, when we look at the discussion here, there's a couple things that pop out. First, in that first sentence, we see the word may. That's a little bit of a red herring. Okay. The moment you see that may include government facilities, so this is written from the government's point of view. It's not a limiter. They're thinking, and again, this is all originally written from the context of 853, which was specifically written for government systems in Rev 4. Rev 5, that changes. So government facilities, private residences of employees is kind of, again, they've got their bias. This explodes out once you get out into the div, and we'll talk about this use case later, but do not take this sentence as a limiter. The other problem that's in this discussion is actually the next may. This becomes a must. You shall, you must. This is a will. This is directive. If you allow work from alternate work sites. This is not an option. Failure to do this is actually going to lead to being a not met. Gets a little bit more strict because you actually have to authorize and identify the types of alternate work sites that are allowed in Rev 3. So again, this is now a must the moment you allow this. Related to this then, DoD, NIST does provide some references to some of their other supporting documentation. It's a little old. This is as of 2016. So it's nice, but not of great use. So I wouldn't necessarily spend too much time in reviewing this and trying to build too much out of this. It's a good starting point. So let's walk through that use case. So we're going to presume in this use case that you've got Chuck from your organization is working outside of your controlled area as you've defined it. Now, when we look at that, there's kind of what I would say are 4 general types of sub-use cases going on. Chuck's working at home. Chuck is working in public spaces and traveling. Now, that traveling includes from your business to Chuck's home, your business to any locations Chuck needs to go to. So traveling is pretty expansive, and make sure you think for it in that context. Now, Chuck, when traveling, may end up in a hotel room. What's allowed in that space? Well, what happens when he's working in a client location? What are your expectations there? Other things as you get into this, things to consider, remember first and foremost, family and loved ones, no matter how much you want to trust them, are not authorized holders. So they should not be hearing, they should not have access to, be able to see, or anything on the devices or media that Chuck brings with him. Likewise, things to consider. Is Chuck allowed to bring that laptop and any of your devices and information while traveling abroad? Consider that. Can be an issue. What happens if Chuck leaves his laptop unattended in a hotel room? Is that going to be allowed? Overhearing conversations about CUI while Chuck's in Starbucks. By the way, Alexa and Siri also are not allowed to hear conversations about CUI and other stuff that Chuck may be discussing. Other things to consider. Wi-Fi access, using public versus, company provided MiFi or tethering out cell phones, things like that. There's a lot of areas in this that you need to look at. You are responsible for defining, and DoD has not provided a whole lot of other specified guidance in this area yet. Now, Rev 3 will give them an opportunity to become specific in this, and hopefully they kind of recognize the need to allow flexibility for businesses to operate. Coming up to this, as you start looking at this, you start figuring this out, it is critical that you understand the things that feed into 310.6. So there are preceding and dependent requirements. Again, requirements have relationships, and if you don't get what I'm saying there, please go watch that CMMC Churns on requirements have relationships. So when we look at 310.6, pausing for coffee here, our first feed-in requirement is 381. Normally, the protection of system media is in the context of the controlled area that you've got this in. Well, now it's outside of the controlled area. Now that person, Chuck, is fully responsible for protecting it. Chuck's responsible. Okay? So this is the media, protecting the media, whether that's printed, digital, on his laptop, everything. Chuck's got it. Chuck's responsible for protecting it and controlling it and securely storing it. So this is the first thing you need to recognize. Next one is limit access. Now is no longer just simply your facility, controlled areas, lock stores, things like that. Chuck is now responsible for limiting access to that system media to Chuck. Nobody else around Chuck normally is going to be an authorized user. So again, your policy, your guidance should reflect this. Likewise, Chuck should control access to the media containing CUI, maintain accountability during transport. This is the core thing. Again, remember that traveling conversation? He is transporting that CUI outside of your facility. He is responsible and must maintain accountability for all CUI assets while it's outside of your facility. Likewise, 310.1, physical access to the system component now is Chuck's responsibility. This now, again, this kind of gets back to that hotel room. Well, 381 is kind of, when the laptop's logged in and somebody's seeing or hearing it, that's live. Laptop shut down, left in the hotel room, on the desk, that gives anybody in the hotel or anybody who can get past the hotel door lock mechanism access to the CUI without any recognition of control or the ability to monitor who's coming and going into that hotel room. So, again, that laptop must have limited access to unauthorized individuals, and that limited access is 0. Likewise, Chuck is responsible for now protecting and monitoring the physical facility and support infrastructure for that. Well, wait a minute. Go back to the hotel room. Chuck doesn't maintain that. Chuck has to maintain some mechanism, either the hotel safe in the room, because he's the only one that knows the combo for that. Cannot use the hotel safe down in the lobby. Not going to work. Or he's got to maintain physical positive control of that device and those components on him at all times. Sorry, same thing at home. Just because you're at home, you cannot leave that CUI device at home in your home office where any of your kids and family or partners, whatever, have access to it. When you're not there, it must be protected and controlled. Now, personal safe, locked drawer, etc., those are things that you can define as acceptable mechanisms. Interestingly, 3.10.6 does feed into another requirement. It is not the end one. This actually does feed into 3.14.7. Identify unauthorized use of organizational systems. Well, wait a minute. Why does it feed into there? Well, we got to dive a little deeper. So 3.14.7 alpha is your requirement to define authorized use of the system. You are now defining authorized use of the system when it's being used in an alternate work site. That's why it feeds into 3.14.7. And the real driver behind 3.14.7 is 3.10.6 alpha. You need to define those safeguarding measures for use of CUI at alternate work sites. That's the feed, and that's why this relationship exists for how we approach this and expect this addressed realistically in 3.14.7. Now, as a part of this, please remember, use those preceding requirements to inform the safeguarding measures you're taking in the context of the use cases and those considerations that we spoke about previously. Those three main axes should be used to define how you set up what you determine as safeguarding measures. Now, when we're looking at this from the assessor point of view, and you see I've already underlined define. Guess what? First thing is, that is now an implicit ODP in a 800.171 Rev 2. Rev 3, things change. They do add an explicit one. So we're not going to address that until this comes out public and we see what guidance DoD provides. Now, that we're expecting from an assessor for you to tell us what and is this approved for all of those safeguarding measures. Remember, draft does not count. Likewise, Bravo is related back again to the normal duality of assessment objectives. How are you going to enforce alpha? And that's the core question. How? Most times this is administrative, so this tends to be policy, so then enforcement is policy driven. Now, when we look at this from an evidentiary object point of view, we can kind of see a little bit more detail on this. Again, if you don't understand these three groupings we're about to go through, please go back and watch the As the CMMC Churns on the three types of evidentiary assessment objects. The first one is the system design documentation. This is going to be your physical environmental protection policy or the content that addresses this in a policy point of view. This can be procedures. You can actually provide staff procedures that they should be following when using CUI at an alternate work site. A checklist. Oh, well, when you're at an alternate work site, you should, at the end of the day, shut down your system, lock it in your desk drawer, blah, blah, blah. Again, taking appropriate mechanisms to ensure it's being protected in a person's home office. Now, visitor management and all that other stuff doesn't necessarily apply, and you can exempt that. Your system security plan will give me a good pointer in general guidance on where you'll find it. However, most of this is going to be in the supplemental documentation. Now, that list of safeguards required, that's typically going to be found in documentation that is approved. The other thing that we tend to really see that drives all this really is in those other relevant documents and records. the most common thing we find is that acceptable use policy. And then we'll also see if you are training and teaching it, we'll see your training plan and curricula. Now, from assistant configuration documentation, generally we don't see a lot of information in this one. Very rarely will we see something. You may do some IP address restrictions, stuff like that. That may pop this up. At that point in time, the most other common thing that we do see is the supplemental artifacts. With regards to that very first one, we've only seen this done when classified is involved. This is commonly done by Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency when you've got a distributed business and one of the business staff maintains a classified component or classified information in their home office. At that point in time, DCSA would come out and conduct an assessment at that alternate worksite location. The most common one we do see, though, is the individually signed acceptable use policies. Now, the simple reality is lawyers want these signed because unless they're signed by the individual accepting and recognizing their responsibility to do this, it's sometimes hard to enforce in a court of law. So we really do want you to have these signed. That's your best practice, is complete proof showing to us that you've done your due diligence. Now, the questions we get into are, well, what happens if, to get an alternate site brought into scope? There's typically a couple common use cases, and they're all related to isolation failures. Most common examples we run into, somebody prints at home, for example. Well, how did they print? What printer did they use? What type of memory does that printer have? Next question is, well, after they printed, how did they destroy the media? Well, where is that guidance for destroying the media and the proof that they destroyed it? And how are you tracking they even printed it? Yeah, now things cascade quickly. Now, that being said, let's briefly put a pause here. Per our policy, Peak InfoSec as an example, we do allow executive leadership teams to print. And we work in a distributed office. We print at our homes. Why? I got to be able to print checks. I got to be able to sign contracts in ink. That's fine. And again, there's executive leadership privilege and responsibilities that, we're not intending to do anything malicious. Otherwise, our policy states that we will not ever print CUI. Related to this, any of our assessors, we've put the isolation controls in that they can't print. So the other one is, well, a staff member maintains removable storage media at home. Well, this is a good use case. Came up for us a couple years ago, interestingly enough. We were doing forensic analysis for a client who went through a malicious attack. We cloned the hard drive, did everything else. Well, now we've got to store their hard drive. We put it in our safe. Oh, well, now I've got their CUI in my safe because literally over the weekend do all this and brought it back up to him. It was a temporary thing. But if that had been a persistent use case, that would have been the use case around storage media. Well, you're maintaining this persistently at your home. Why is that? So again, these are things that you do need to look at and take into consideration when you're handling these. Other one we ran into, and this is kind of a weird one, the last two kind of fit together. So it wasn't just an alternate work site the person was working from. They maintained servers at that person's home, and not only servers, backup tapes, things like it was kind of really like, wait, what? Yeah, that was their alternate worksite location in case of, alternate location in case of failure for DR. And they actually established a site-to-site VPN tunnel between the person's home and their business. Yeah, I'll leave you guys pondering that one. Yeah, you can quickly understand why that home office and what they were doing got brought into scope. Issues here, again, these are some of the things we've actually ran into that brings things into scope from a alternate work site. Now, let's kind of sum this up. So alternate work site is all about what your staff can do when they're working outside of your controlled area. That's what you're defining, if you allow it. This is mostly an administrative managed security requirement. We are literally looking, do you have an acceptable use policy? Is it signed? And in reality, that the enforcement mechanism is going to be the end of that policy should be a failure to comply statement is subject to disciplinary actions, blah, blah, blah. You know the statement, HR will always have them, and they should have them on all of your policies, by the way. So use the 4 focus area, 4 use cases and those different conditional areas to make you start thinking when you are allowing access to CUI outside of your environment. Please remember this includes listening, and Siri and, Alexa cannot listen in even on CUI conversations. So document all of this in your acceptable use policy and have your staff sign it, please. Best way to solve this problem. And then isolation failures will cause your work sites to be brought into scope. So really make sure your isolation mechanisms work well. If you allow any exceptions to them, i.e. executives needing to print, sign contracts, make sure that's documented as authorized exception. So again, I'm Matt Titcomb with Peak InfoSec. Thank you for joining us for this as the CMMC Churns.